Welcome, comrades. You're listening to the Party Line podcast from The Ditch. News and comment from Ireland on theditch.com. I'm Harry Browne.
I'm Niamh, Bhriain, and you can follow the Party Line wherever you watch or listen to your podcasts, and follow The Ditch on all your apps. You can like and subscribe and give us 5 stars.
We're joined by Paulie Doyle from The Ditch. How are you, Paulie?
Good to be with you.
And on Zoom, we have our very first repeat guest on the Party Line, because we've just been dying to see him these last few days. He's the father of the feast when it comes to Starmer's decline, the font of Starmenfreude, the author of The Fraud, as seen in the House of Commons this week, the definitive book on the Starmer and Morgan McSweeney project. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Paul Holden. Hiya, Paul.
Hi guys, nice to see you again.
Lovely to see you.
Paul.
Paul was on episode 2, and obviously, Paul, we're only kidding, because you would take no satisfaction, I'm sure, from seeing the misfortune of Keir Starmer and his project. But as we talked about when we had you on in March, and we'll talk about it again later, one of the people that Starmer and his acolytes eventually tried hardest to smear was Paul Holden himself. And so we'll talk about what the Labour Together project again.
Yeah, so we'll talk in a little bit to Paul, but first, maybe just to mention that we're recording this on Thursday, and we will get into political events that are taking place in England this week. In London, things are moving fast. Keir Starmer is still in place. We don't know when we get off the podcast if that will still be the case. Let's see. So we'll talk to Paul about all of that in a while, but first we're going to talk to Paulie about the Ditch story. So you've also got an upcoming by-election story.
Yeah, there's been some reporting about this ongoing WRC case involving the former CEO of Inland Fisheries Ireland. About 4.5 years into his tenure as CEO, he was removed from his position. He's brought forward a case, and that's ongoing. But throughout the proceedings, it's emerged that in September 2022, he made a complaint to the guards alleging that a sitting senator had attempted to intimidate and blackmail him into ending an investigation into another senior member of Inland Fisheries Ireland. And that senator was unnamed until earlier this week, when we identified him as Fine Gael's Galway West by-election candidate, Sean Kine. So it's an interesting week. Sean Kine, I think, is ahead in the polls at the moment.
Yeah.
He was formerly TD, paid his dues, and then was appointed to the Seanad, I think, in 2000. Another example of the Seanad being a kind of a clearinghouse for people who lose their seat.
A waiting room, you might say.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Yeah. So, Francis O'Donnell gets, just, to explain what happened a bit more, to give a bit more context, Francis O'Donnell gets a protected disclosure is made in February of 2022 about another senior person at the organization. He follows the procedures. He suspends them pending the outcome of the investigation. He says that the following summer, he has an interaction with a senior civil servant in the Department of Energy, and they make clear to him that they've been speaking with a senator, and if this investigation doesn't go away, then the contents of a separate protected disclosure, which was made against him, would be made public.
Right.
So by September, he's gone to the guards and he's made a formal complaint saying, I am being blackmailed. Now, after he makes that complaint in September of 2022, Sean Kine, under Seanad privilege, starts making a number of disparaging remarks about him, accusing him of various acts of wrongdoing. And he also receives anonymous letters to his office making various allegations against him. So this guy is adamant that he's been subject to a campaign of intimidation and blackmail. So he's alleging that this has been going on. Sean Kine is responsible for it.
A lot of this came out in a Workplace Relations Commission case
Yes.
in March, but the senator in question wasn't named until the Ditch named him. Has Sean Kine responded?
He has yet to respond.
Right.
We put it all to him,
Of course, yeah.
but he hasn't. He has no comment so far.
And other media taking any interest in the fact that Sean Kine is the senator unidentified, but now identified in his complaint?
Not yet. We're hoping that they will, and I'll just say that if anybody is interested in pursuing it, I'm happy to share all the relevant documentation anything that you would like, if you're interested in, if you need something to help you get it over the line, it's not a problem. So we would love to see, because it's an important thing. I mean, this guy is running for office, and these are serious, I'll say they're allegations, but I think that he should have to address them, and it is being looked at by the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau, as far as I know.
Yeah. Link in the show notes, as we
Yes,
say.
yeah, we
well
can
done.
link in the show notes. I was in before the Oireachtas committee when they were reviewing the triple lock legislation last year, and Sean Kine was on the committee, and he seemed to suggest that even if there was no UN mandate for Irish troops to be in Lebanon, there would be a moral mandate. And I kind of called him a question. It said, who's giving you the moral mandate? Is it coming from God or, and he really didn't like that at all and asked if I was threatening him.
Yeah. Are you threatening me?
Yeah, yeah, it's on the Dáil record or the Oireachtas record of the committee.
Sounds
Are
like a
you
very
threatening me?
sensitive goal, doesn't it?
Yes.
So it's interesting that this has come around, an allegation of him threatening someone else.
So very much, a government will be a government TD if he's elected, and he is the front runner, as we were saying, and he is an opponent of the triple lock for sure. Is the government hewing to the government line on that, as Niamh discovered in the Oireachtas.
To talk about the other one.
Go on, yeah.
Well, Ray McAdam, who is another by-election candidate
for Fine Gael again.
Fine Gael again, great week for Fine Gael, has been using the Lord Mayor's car, which is given to him. It's part of a sponsorship deal with Volvo, that the Lord Mayor has access to this car. Dublin City Council has made clear that this is for official mayor's business, and he's using it to attend various campaign events.
Right. So he's Lord Mayor. He's running for the Dáil now
Yes.
in the by-election, and he's using the Lord Mayor's car to do that. And the ditch is being inundated with photographs of the car on various streets around various campaign events, right?
Describe the car.
Well,
Maybe our listeners can say
it has the recognizable reg. It's just
Exactly.
number one.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there was an event in Ballybock, and it was inviting all the different candidates to give their position on more resources for SNAs, what should be available, and try to get them to sign a pledge. So Ray McAdam shows up, is the only person who attends who doesn't sign the pledge, and he's like, "Oh, I have a policy of not signing pledges, even if I agree with them," which clearly he does. And then he leaves early, and he goes around the corner to the Boar's Head to his official campaign launch, and he's attended all of this with his official car. And then we put this out. We start getting images being sent to us, and he's using the car the next day. It's seen outside of a pub after he's been again canvassing in North Dublin. So
okay.
I'm looking forward to the AI sightings of the Lord Mayor's car at various compromised locations coming up. We'll turn now, I think, to our regular look at something we saw in the non-ditch media, the NDM. Will we? And we were talking here about, we've touched on this a little bit, the rampant Irish anti-Semitism, and it really came up a lot in Ireland over the last few days because we had Boy George in the Late Late Show discussing it. Yeah.
It was an interesting thing to see, wasn't it? I mean, he was kind of positioning himself as a brave defender of
Jewish people in London. Yes. Yes. Against the Irish who are apparently ready to go over there.
It's like, he turns to the crowd and he's like, in this very kind of strange way, he's like, "Give me a round of applause if you know any Jewish people."
He didn't even say, "Give me a round of applause." He just said, "Do any of you know any Jewish people?" And nobody shouted out, "Woohoo, yes, we do. We love Jewish people." And he said, well, very telling silence.
It's because there's like 2,000 Jewish people in Ireland.
Yeah.
Total.
Would it be a telling silence if people said they didn't know any Somali people in Ireland, even though there are thousands of Somali people living here?
So even if you did, would you shout out on the Late Late Show? Yes, I do. It was really bizarre, the whole context that the conversation happened in, because he was talking about clothes and stuff that his mother had, like dresses and stuff like this. And then suddenly he was looking out into the audience going, "Does anyone here know any Jewish person?" And there's a long silence because it's just a very bizarre thing to say out to the audience. And then he goes, "That silence is very telling." And then it's kind of as if he's kind of berating the Irish people for being anti-Semitic
And well, that was
which
certainly how it was picked up
yeah.
anyway. And the important thing about this, well, one, the Late Late Show is the most popular show on Irish television, obviously, apart from an important football game, and it is something that a lot of people watched and has a kind of archetypal significance here in Ireland. But also, this was picked up very heavily internationally. So you got coverage in the States and coverage in Israel, in particular, about yet more evidence of Irish anti-Semitism. And the evidence, as we said, literally consisted of nobody shouted out, nobody cried out when Boy George asked the Late Late Show audience.
A bat signal,
Yes,
somebody like these events and goes up in the air, and then all of these various actors in the media and online on social media kind of activate, and they have to use, it's kind of funny that it's Boy George. They'll use like whatever material, they have to use whatever material they have. So they're like, look at this brave, virtuous man who in 2009 was convicted of chaining a sex worker to a radiator in his house and did 15 months in prison. He's bravely defending the Jewish people, and the Irish people are
the Irish people are disgraced.
contemptuous towards him.
So it was in the context of that we noticed this piece in a new online publication, a newish online publication called Equator. We mentioned Equator a few weeks ago when we were talking about Homeland Empire, the piece that Nikhil Pal Singh did about Donald Trump. Paul, you know Equator, don't you? The editor you were telling us is a former Guardian journalist. Is that right?
Yeah, he was a former Guardian editor. His name's Jonathan Shannon. Very interesting guy, very insightful. My sense was that I think he maybe edited Owen Jones for a while on the comment desk. And the sense that I've got is that maybe he was too left wing for the Guardian's tastes, and has moved on to slightly more recipient pastures,
Right.
and more
Yeah.
convivial places where he can express reasonable left wing ideas without being censored and edited out.
Yeah, that too left wing for the Guardian. I know that there are probably people, even in our audience, who think that sounds a little strange, but that is the real world that we're living in, where there's quite a few things and quite a few people that are too left wing for the Guardian. And
Yeah, I'm afraid that if you look at the coverage of the Guardian of British politics in general and how the Guardian actually has changed as an institution, I think that's actually an interesting discussion. Certainly from 2015 onwards, that there's actually been a significant hardening of its position and an intolerance of sort of even quite mild left-wing stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, the piece that we're looking at today doesn't directly involve the current crisis in British politics, but it does indirectly because it deals with the issue that has kind of dominated a lot of left discussion really for the last 7 or 8 years, and that is kind of anti-Semitism and anti-anti-Semitism. It's an interview with Bhriain, who's a really interesting scholar of anti-Semitism, and it's headlined "Good Jews, Bad Jews." And again, we'll put a link in the show notes to this. And Bhriain in this interview on anti-Semitism makes some points that are probably quite familiar to people. One is that, the idea that that the current public discourse about anti-Semitism is defined by two claims. First, that Jews are the victims of Muslims and of the pro-Palestine left, and that it needs to be policed, and that this allows the far right to reposition itself as the only true defenders of Jews. So that, for example, Farage has become kind of the hero of Golders Green because the far right are the ones most willing to target Muslims in policing. And then the second part is, again, relatively familiar, that the Israeli state positions itself as the answer to Jewish history, as the state of all Jews, and therefore diaspora Jews are effectively human shields for Israel because because of this identification between Israel and the Jewish people, there is a sense in which all Jews are held responsible, in effect, for the actions of the Israeli state. So that really interesting aspect of it. But there are also some more unique arguments in this interview, and that is the suggestion that essentially anti-Semitism, as adopted by most Western politicians and states in recent years, is a buttress of Western power itself, and therefore terrible in the long run for Jewish people. To quote Bhriain, "It provides a way to express discontent with powerlessness when real social change feels impossible and when politics is narrated as a form of racial and cultural conflict. So what we've lost is an anti-racist universalism, What we have instead is an image of Jews as the protected minority of Western power, a strategy for defending Western power, which, of course, ultimately throws Jews under the bus. So three overlapping crises, says Bhriain: stagnation in living standards, and with that enormous ballooning billionaire wealth, the shift of the geographical center of world capitalism away from the West, and migration flows into the old core of imperial power, into Europe and North America, which generates political turmoil. And in this climate, the alleged anti-Semite, variously imagined as the radical left, the Muslim immigrant, or the Palestinian, is cast as the face of the crisis. That, in other words, the real threat to the civilized order and to the declining potency of the West is these various minorities that constitute this kind of the representation of Palestine. The absence of a genuine emancipatory alternative in our politics generates a rising anti-Semitism and a panic that is less about protecting Jews than it is about protecting the Western order. So that's a long quote there from Bhriain, but I think worth thinking about in the context of a discussion with Paul, which really has a lot to do with the way anti-Semitism and anti-anti-Semitism has been employed in the West and in Britain in particular over recent years.
There was an interest just on, I suppose, some of the contradictions of, the concerns, particularly in Britain, about anti-Semitism. There was a Twitter account a number of years ago called Client Journalism UK. It's not there anymore. But it put up a tweet, which I think actually captured everything really well. And it said, if Jeremy Corbyn is this massive racist, why isn't he the most popular politician in Britain?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's kind of like, all of these people, all of these enormous racists, in every other regard, we're to believe concerned about anti-Semitism, which justifies them taking all of these, authoritarian actions to curtail it.
Curtail Muslims.
Yeah. And I suppose something I would add as well is that, a lot of the far right, who position themselves as these defenders of Jews, I mean, it's worth mentioning that they see their political aspirations realized in Israel.
Yes.
That's why they identify with it. It's an ethno-state. It is engaged in a campaign of genocide and ethnic cleansing, and it's bringing about a world in which the kind of violence needed to, create a fascist society here, is going to be allowed.
Yeah, exactly. And Paul, we have tended to see the anti-Semitism phenomenon in terms of its direct use to sort of bring down Jeremy Corbyn, to police the left in the Labour Party and to police pro-Palestine sentiment in the Labour Party. How does this kind of like wider picture of the uses of anti-Semitism fit in with that story, which is part of the story that you tell in your book?
I mean, it's a complicated history, it's a complicated discussion. But I do think what's interesting about this particular moment of anti-Semitism and Bhriain's interview, and by the way, I should just say, just if I may, give a shout out to another magazine called Vashti Media, which is quite a small outlet in the UK, which is edited exclusively and written exclusively by Jewish anti-Zionists, generally speaking, or Jewish non-Zionists or Jewish non-conformists. That Barnaby's also contributed to, and they do lots of writing on this stuff, and they do interesting stuff here. But I mean, I think the anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party, which I've argued is, partly was a semi-organic overreaction, but also it was quite a significant part of it was a political campaign run by undisclosed actors to destroy Jeremy Corbyn. Basically, because there was a pretty clear-eyed sense from people like Morgan McSweeney, who was chief of staff to the Prime Minister, and his associates, that you couldn't really displace Jeremy Corbyn democratically. You couldn't actually beat him in the Labour Party in a battle of ideas. And we now know that actually the role of Labour Together, this organisation that Morgan McSweeney headed for ages, was very profound in stoking the anti-Semitism crisis in very particular ways and with certain types of impacts. One of which I think people are only beginning to understand it now, is that the form of the argument of the anti-Semitism crisis was to try and through the media and basically through alarmist reporting and sort of building a constant sense of hype, is to build a bedrock of evidence to prove that anti-Semitism is inherent in being in the leftist tradition. That in fact anti-Semitism is one of the endpoint expressions of inevitable endpoint expressions of anti-imperialism and leftist thinking, that it's suffused within it, it's essential to it in a sense. And that poses a direct material threat to Jewish people, right? And in order to make that argument, you have to do a whole range of things, one of which is not reported properly. But second of all, you've got to massively expand what you consider to be anti-Semitism. Because if your technique, your rhetorical technique is to say, well, we're trying to build an argument that the left is anti-Semitic, then we must interpret everything the left says about an issue like Israel in the most bad faith possible way, or to start putting in requirements about what you can and can't say about Israel, to the point where at the end point of the anti-Semitism crisis, you were, one of the examples I give in my book is you have an elderly Jewish woman who's investigated on her deathbed for anti-Semitism because she had posted on Facebook that Israel's an apartheid state. Right. That's like the malignant outcome of this stuff. And what the anti-Semitism crisis did, it did so much profound and deep damage to the fabric of British politics and the left. And one of the outcomes is that there has been effectively what the anti-Semitism crisis did in ways that people didn't quite even understand at the time, is it's basically dignified and established a far-right argument as truth in the mainstream media. And the fact, as Bhriain says, I think very acutely, he says the far-right diagnosis of our society is that there are effectively degenerate actors who are undermining the essence of some sort of core British goodness. People taking advantage, whether they're welfare claimants, whether they asylum seekers, whether they're Muslims, whether they are left-wing people. And effectively what the anti-Semitism crisis did was create a bedrock of effectively undeniable evidence. And I'll come to how that's undeniable and a bit how rhetorically that was done as well. But
yeah, undeniable with big scare quotes. Yeah.
So basically, at that point, it's undeniable in the sense that if you do deny it, then you're also anti-Semitic. Right. So if you say, by 2018, 2019, if you're starting to say things like, well, actually, I think this anti-Semitism crisis thing doesn't really make a lot of sense, or I think this is overblown, or I think these examples don't make sense, or I think there's undeclared political actors working here, which there were, or I think people are pursuing this for agendas they're not disclosing, or I think there's dodgy money here, which there was, or I think there's, a plot to widen the scope of anti-Semitism for political ends, which there was. If you said any of those things, you were yourself anti-Semitic. And actually, that was the basis upon which a whole bunch of Jewish people would then get effectively charged with being anti-Semitic and be suspended or expelled from the Labour Party and effectively harassed out of public life. It's how you get this moment in 2022 where there's an election for the NEC of the Labour Party, which is the ruling body. And the only Jewish woman elected to the NEC is Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi, who is somebody who said publicly, I think the anti-Semitism crisis was weaponized for political ends. And the Board of Deputies and Jewish Leadership Council and all these organizations are basically saying, you need to boot her off the NEC. The only woman on the NEC can't be on there because the way she understands Zionism and anti-Semitism is so anti-Semitic, it taints the party. So the broader thing that's happened effectively is that even though it's gone a bit quiet over the last couple of years, it's now sitting dormant as this thing in British society that effectively the far right diagnosis of society is right, that actually there is this deep and abiding threat to Jewish people, and it comes from an alliance of left-wing people working with Muslims, right? Which is incidentally also, or then it gets broadened a bit because then it's left-wing people working in alliance with Muslims or any subaltern group that is sympathetic with Palestine, so whether they're black or or minority ethnic, and that means that when Bhriain gives this interview, I think the other piece of context that's important is that it's in the context of a new line of this being basically reinvigorated as an attack line against Zach Polanski as the head of the Green Party. And what we've seen, really we've seen the anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party, which took 5 years to get to the point where the evidence is undeniable. They've established, in the mainstream press, they've effectively tried to establish this idea that the Greens are anti-Semitic in a week.
Yeah.
Right. And to a certain extent, they've all basically agreed that this is the case. Margaret Hodge gave an interview on Channel 4, or maybe it was Radio 4, saying the Green Party is anti-Semitic. The evidence they have, which is really flimsy, is basically 3 council candidates said things. which may or may not be problematic. I'm not going to weigh into that. But this is three council candidates out of 4,000 in a party of 230,000. And yet somehow this whole party is now like an anti-Semitic threat to Jews. And that's why you can have a march against anti-Semitism where Zach Polanski is not invited, or a summit on anti-Semitism where Zach Polanski, the only Jewish political leader, is not invited, but Nigel Farage is invited. Nigel Farage, who, there's been multiple first-hand testimonies of him doing pretty disgusting, despicable things when he was at school, to fellow Jewish classmates, right? So there is, I've been watching the last couple of weeks with a deep sense of worry and despair at the extent to which that work of the anti-Semitism crisis has been so rapidly reactivated, and how in this context, because it was always terrible when it happened in the first instance, but this is now the context of an ongoing genocide, right? Where this nasty, and excuse my language, bullshit campaign run by people like Morgan McSweeney is having such deep and profound impacts on the globe and makes me want to pull the tiny amount of hair that I still have out of my head when I watch it. So that was a very long answer to a question.
It's a very good answer. Thank you, Paul. Let's stay with Labour Together and the way that they, weaponized anti-Semitism and other forms of attack on the left, because we had this week some revelations coming from inside Labour Together. A number of people have made subject access requests for information about what data, emails, messages, etc., what data Labour Together, which was the Morgan McSweeney kind of think tank within the Labour Party, what information they had on them. So we saw Owen Jones doing a piece this week about how he was being discussed within Labour Together. John McDonnell has come out and said he's got his file on that. So can you talk to us a little bit about what we've learned new about how Labour Together maneuvered to destroy the left within the Labour Party? Not only with
Sure.
anti-Semitism.
And I think the first thing, I think the context of the subject access requests is interesting. So basically, the reason why people have submitted all these subject access requests, pretty much all at exactly the same time, was when it emerged more fully earlier this year, the extent to which Labour Together had run effectively a smear operation, an investigative smear operation targeting journalists who were trying to report on Labour Together. Primarily me and my colleagues, although not exclusively, because there were some other journalists who were caught up in the dragnet of this investigation, and how Labour Together director, a guy called Josh Simons, had reported me to GCHQ, to security services, and demanded that I be investigated on the mad allegation that I was some sort of connected to Russian intelligence somehow. Just mad, crazy, ridiculous stuff. And in response to that, there was a sense of like something's really gotten rotten here. They were doing really nasty stuff, surveilling people. Loads of politicians need to find out, and lots of different actors were like, what on earth has Labour Together been doing behind the scenes? So this is why the subject access requests have been made. And they are, and I should say, by the way, I'm not going to talk about it for various reasons, but I have now got my subject access request, and you will be hearing about that sooner rather than later. But it has been a disturbing thing to read through and see what they were saying about me and what they were trying to do to me and my family. The stuff from Owen Jones, I find sort of intellectually fascinating, because basically what we have is, all his documents is basically them talking about Owen Jones behind the scenes. Now, on the one hand, what they show is that Morgan McSweeney and his allies basically despised Owen Jones. They thought that Owen Jones was a threat to their political budget, which he plainly was, because, their political project from 2017 onwards is quite clearly, we need to destroy Jeremy Corbyn from within. We need to destroy his institutional basis of support in the Labour Party. One of the things they were doing was basically secretly inflaming the anti-Semitism crisis. And Owen Jones, and obviously he's caught flack on the left for not doing it aggressively enough, but on the left, he was basically making a counter argument that was resonating, which is to say, sure, there's some anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, as there is throughout society, but at the same time, the attacks on the leadership here don't make any sense. This is confected, this is weaponized, and Labour Together found that a threatening form of argument to their political project. But at the same time, and this is what I find really, I think it's such a distillation of how messed up this project is that we now know that in mid 2017, McSweeney produces the strategy document for Labour Together. He sets out this plan to destroy Jeremy Corbyn. And he's like, these are the things that make Jeremy Corbyn popular. These are the things that like allows him to succeed. One of which is like a vibrant left-wing media, which he then goes out to destroy, which he does very quite successfully through these dodgy secret campaigns. And the second thing he says is that we also need to create independent seeming left voices putting forward our narrative, which is what they do. It's a fascinating story. So what Morgan McSweeney does is he approaches these two young women, Marie LeConte, who's a journalist, and Gráinne Maguire, who's an Irish comedian, and says, I want to do a podcast called Changing Politics. And what he does is he basically funds this whole thing, Morgan McSweeney. It's his idea. He finds the producer. He pays for it. He writes the scripts. He finds the guests. Now, at the time, Labour Together wasn't declaring its donation. So basically, this podcast was being funded with basically Morgan McSweeney slush fund, Labour Together slush fund. At no stage is it declared at any point that Labour Together has any role in this podcast whatsoever. It's not declared that Morgan McSweeney is writing it. And then the guests that they have on are primarily people connected to Labour Together, and it presents them in a positive way. So the first guest on the podcast is Steve Reid, who's a cabinet minister, a director of Labour Together. And it's basically extolling how brilliant he is, and he's got a private members bill they're busy passing. And so you basically what you have is this secret astroturf advertorial for Labour Together politicians being funded with this undeclared money without the public being told. But then there's an additional layer of like how messed up this is because they're trying to position themselves in a particular point in the left where they would think that their end point was they were going to use changing politics to inflame divisions on the Corbynite left between like Remainers and Brexiteers, whatever. And so the podcast itself is extremely woke. If I don't particularly like that term, but that's probably the best way to describe it. Is that it's very, I'm very woke, so that's not a criticism from my perspective. So it's very pro-migrant rights, it's pro-asylum rights, it's pro-trans rights, right? And it's these like really interesting capsules in time where Morgan McSweeney is writing this stuff very cynically to appeal to these audiences, saying, they interview an asylum seeker who's traveled over on a small boat. And they're like, wow, your life is so tough. We really must make things easier for you. They interview trans people and like how difficult it is to transition in the UK as part of a project that when they get into power is absolutely horrific on all of these things, right? Has like led an attack on trans rights in the UK, has also like basically gone to the right of the Tories ever did on asylum seekers and reform and settlement and stuff like that. So it's this like deep, profound, mad cynicism at the heart of this project that you'll basically seduce people on false pretenses to support a political project that when it wins will betray those people you've just seduced. It is fascinating from like a political perspective. I find it just so illustrative of like how messed up and cynical this project actually was.
And the documents suggest that part of the way that they kind of portray themselves as woke, and as you say, like in some ways genuinely, the hosts are certainly, is to say, let's have Owen Jones on, and that they're going to be on the face of it inclusive, just as Labour Together, even in its name, was kind of projecting an image of we're all in this together on the left, while it was actually tearing the left apart.
Yeah, and the thing that's interesting about this is, there's a broader political thing about how, what this says about the cynicism and hypocrisy of this project and its dirty methods. But also, like, there's an interpersonal aspect here, because I interviewed Gráinne for the book, right? And I spoke to Gráinne Maguire and I said, what was your experience like on this podcast? And she was like, I was utterly convinced, utterly convinced that Morgan McSweeney shared exactly the same politics as me. And she told me that in 2024 she basically left the Labour Party and she voted for the Greens because she was like, I was horrified by their approach on trans rights, I was horrified by their approach on Gaza. Basically, I think this is the most horrific government. But I thought at the time, in my engagements with Morgan McSweeney, that we were simpatico. And it's on that basis that I worked with him. And actually, that's a story that gets told again and again and again. The number of people that Morgan McSweeney personally would go in like develop quite close professional, personal relationships with. We were saying, work with me. I've got the same politics as you. We've got the same objectives. And then they find out years later, actually, he's procured their cooperation in a project to design to destroy their own politics.
I was just going to ask how long the podcast ran for. So how long were they kind of up and running with this covert project? And also how were they like, do we know how they were internally measuring success?
Oh, yeah, interesting questions. Because actually, one of the things that comes up from some of the SARs is like the extent to which Labour Together is polling the Labour Party membership more than anything else, right? They're constantly polling the Labour Party membership. That comes out in John McDonnell's SARs. It's like they're constantly measuring the impacts of their own projects behind the scenes. So they are getting like YouGov polling. I mean, the podcast itself runs for 2 seasons. It's about a year it's on air. I think they do about 16 episodes.
Mhm.
In the end, according to Grania and Marie, McSweeney essentially absconds and doesn't pay them for the last bits of work.
Oh God.
And they've written about how they had to carry on sending him these messages, being like, "Can we get paid, please? We did this work with two young journalists who are like barely scraping by. What are you doing?" But also, the thing that's interesting about it from my perspective, yeah, you can tell I love talking about this as a topic, is that the podcast is awful. Like it is unlistenable. Like it is spectacularly terrible. Like a bit like even on like the most basic level, the production values are like abominable. They'll have like an interview with somebody that they've recorded and that you can't hear what they're saying
Mm.
for like 15 minutes. They're like mumbling into a microphone or something. And to me, it's like this is the ultimate dict. This to me is like such a useful illustration of like the issue of the labor right, which is they can destroy everything. They are absolutely brilliant at wrecking everything, but they cannot create a thing that's worth anything of value.
Mm.
Because this thing is like it's unlistenable. It is like an embarrassment of a podcast, genuinely.
Mm.
All right, our glass house is at risk here. We better be careful about throwing any more stones
I
at
mean, you guys are
ourselves.
basically like at this point, you may as well be like a Hollywood production level compared to what they were doing.
Well, I think that brings us to the larger labor right and the state of it at the moment, Paul. I saw earlier in the week the Guardian podcast was titled "Why Does Everyone Hate Keir Starmer?" Um, so, Paul, why does everyone hate Keir Starmer?
Where do we even like begin with that? I just wrote a book about why everybody hates Keir Starmer. So I just
Why everyone
summarize the whole
should
thing.
hate Keir
Well,
Starmer?
yeah.
Yes.
Well, the thing is, so that's actually a good point, and I think that's the interesting thing is to say, I think everybody should dislike this guy. It's why has everybody come to dislike this guy? That's a different, and those are two different questions, right? Actually, um, so the first starting point is that nobody liked him. So that's the thing you got to bear in mind with Keir Starmer. It's not like what we've seen over the last 2 years is like an incredibly loved, well-loved politician or well-liked or well-regarded politician suddenly become unpopular. Like if you look at the polling, as much as I despise somebody like Tony Blair, when he came into power, he was genuinely extremely popular, and he had virtues as a popular politician. He was very charismatic. You look at the Ipsos polling from the time, he had a plus 45% approval rating across society. It's like unimaginable in the current moment, right? Starmer never had that. Starmer was always either people were indifferent to him or they didn't like him. And, when they won that election in 2024, and I write about this in the book, it's an incredibly thin and unstable victory that they've procured because they only won on 34% of the vote, right? So that it's a tiny, it's less total absolute votes than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2017 and 2019. It's considerably less than the vote share they got in 2017, which is they get 34% in 2024. It's 40% in 2017 under Jeremy. And there is a hollowing out already of Labour Party's voting coalition. So the best example I give in the book is actually Keir Starmer's own constituency, where in the 2024 general election, he got 17,000 votes. I think 18,000 votes. And partially because he was challenged by my colleague Andrew Feinstein, who came second and he got 7,000 votes. But Starmer's majority was massively dented, right? It was the lowest vote share he'd ever gotten as an MP. It's the lowest vote share a Labour politician has gotten, I think, since 2010. He's the only incoming prime minister who's ever seen his own personal majority slashed in such a profound way to actually go down coming into an election, right? And then if you look at the polling that came out around about the time of election, there was all this polling then like, why did the Labour Party win? What was the reason you voted for the Labour Party? And 90% of the respondents in the UK said uh, to get the Tories out. 1% of the respondents said because we like Keir Starmer. He was a 1% factor in the Labour Party winning that election, right?
That's in the
Now
Martin
that's a
America.
problem because then there's the question of how does he become unpopular? And it's actually, I'm going to concertina in a lot of history into a very simple answer, which is that this is a political project that's based on fundamental misdirection and dishonesty about winning power by misleading people about what you're going to do with power. So they do that in 2020 to get Keir Starmer elected leader of the Labour Party. They confect Morgan McSweeney and Labour together confect an image of Keir Starmer as a radical eco-socialist in the Corbynite tradition, which he obviously wasn't going to be. And then as soon as he wins power, he becomes indistinguishable from every right-wing Labour leader there ever has been. And then in the lead up to the general elections, very interesting is that they basically put your manifesto and to the public, which bears no relationship to what they actually do in power. And so people vote on this idea of this like quite anodyne manifesto, but which doesn't include key things that they're actually planning to do. And everybody pretty much knew internally that it was a sham. That what they were suggesting in their manifesto was never what they were actually going to do. This was just an elaborate set piece. And that's why, as soon as Keir Starmer comes into power, the first thing they do is cut winter fuel allowance, right? Which is deeply unpopular, which is basically a standard entitlement for anybody over the age of 65, which does immediately throw a lot of very poor pensioners into like real fuel poverty and general poverty, right? And then at the same time, this freebie scandal then kicks off, which is really a scandal about a lack of scrutiny because the media failed to report it before the election. And what happens is that there is this profound and deep sense, which is true. That's the problem that the Labour Party has, is that people were fundamentally misled about who Keir Starmer and the Labour Party were before the election. And then they found out and they hated it, just in the same way. And I used this analogy before. When Keir Starmer was elected leader of the Labour Party, they had 500,000 members. I did a story with the Times 3, 4 weeks ago. They now have 250,000 members, right? Because the Labour Party membership, as soon as it actually encountered the real Keir Starmer, half of them were like, screw it, we're out of here. 2024, oh, now we see the 2026 local elections. It's literally the same thing. Labour Party got 34% of the national elections. This time around, they've got 17% vote share. They've scared off half of their voters because they've come to actually acknowledge what this project actually is. And I was looking at this incredible image that was put out. It was this is September 2024, right? So this is 3 months after Starmer's elected. And there was a word map that was done by, I think it's Savanta, who does it, it's a polling company, where they go to like a room, they go to different people and they say, what is the number one word you associate with Keir Starmer? Now, before the election, it was like boring, dull, good man, try hard, professional, tie, suit, the sort of pretty anodyne stuff. And you look at this thing and like bold writing over every single word, it's like dominating this thing, liar. It just says liar on this thing. That's basically everybody in Britain basically thought he was a liar, which he was.
Mm.
And
Legacy.
and this is now basically like in a society where 15, 20 years of austerity on top of 40 years of Thatcherism, like in the wake of like an anti-Semitism crisis, like huge amounts of social tension being pushed and divided by far right forces, where like trust in politicians is at an all-time low, to basically have an electorate that's like, finally, we've gotten rid of the Tories for the first time in 14 years, and then boom, actually, we've just brought in some more Tories. It's devastating to what people think about the political process. It's devastating to the Labour Party, and it's precisely the danger that I predicted. I was like, this sort of stuff, these sorts of projects, this lack of scrutiny, this sort of lying. This is a gift to Nigel Farage. This is the stuff that creates the conditions for the far right.
Do you have any sense of whether the Labour right feel as though they've actually accomplished anything? Or is it more like wielding power is an end in itself? We've done that, therefore we've been successful?
It's very, I find it hard to psychologize the labor right
Mm.
because on the one hand, they behave in ways that seem so they behave so appallingly so often that I can't understand how they conceive of themselves. But what is very clear is that they thought that they really have this incredible sense of their own competence and their own ability.
The adults are back in the
Like,
room.
yeah, exactly that off the back of the room. That like they that they were going to oversee a 10, 15 year Blairite restoration. Because and partly it's because from 2023 onwards, when it's plain the Tories are not going to win again after Liz Truss, that the media and business leaders are all rushing to Labour's door and basically carrying favour with them, refusing to scrutinise them, effectively fating these people, building them up. And it's like endless profiles about what brilliant geniuses these people are. Look at how they've vanquished the idiot, deranged Corbynite left. They've kicked them out of society. They're no longer, this is amazing, this incredible achievement. And now look at them, they wear suits, and business leaders like them, and they think they're good arbiters. And JP Morgan saying, yes, we're going to invest in stuff. And there is this presumption that they are just this deeply, profoundly competent people. As it turns out, they basically had no plan, meaningful plan for government. And of course, from my perspective as a left-wing person, like their diagnosis of society is so fundamentally wrong. Of course, it was going to fail.
Mm.
I mean, the labor rights diagnosis, which is basically you need to have like an incrementalist status quo, big defense spending, cut welfare, crack down on civil liberties combination, doesn't just make a worse society. It's not going to resolve any of the problems that are like people are trying to vote on. Of course, it was going to fail. So, my sense from the Labour right is that, their coping mechanism is probably either, oh, we just made a series of missteps, or we're being unfairly attacked. Um, but fundamentally, they'll never ever admit that they were wrong about anything, ever. It's just not within their DNA.
Partly the mission, of course, was to destroy the left. And in that sense, it's mission accomplished.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think actually, they were extremely successful in destroying and alienating the left in the Labour Party from 2020 onwards. It is incomplete and it is extremely unstable the way they've done it because effectively this project is the Labour right has always been this project, but this particular version of the Labour right, the Labour Together project, is really a project that has captured. It's a very right-wing project that is very right-wing on a whole bunch of things like immigration, on trans rights, I think is profoundly, deeply racist in many ways. Is right-wing economically, is corporatist in all the worst possible ways. Is inviting Palantir into the NHS, all the worst aspects of like you'd expect of sort of neoliberal, pro-imperialist Tories. They're no different to them, right? And I've now lost the thread of my
Yeah, no,
conversation
just
talking
in
about how
terms of
much I hate them.
talk to us
Oh,
about,
it's not stable.
yeah, and is the
Yeah,
table set
because
for a reform government now? Is that fair to say? And in that sense, that this Labour right has opened the door to a far right British government.
yes, I think it's definitely opened the door for a right British government because obviously reform is polling up at the most. I think one of the fundamental strategic errors of this project, right, is that they didn't understand the function of the Labour Party to capital. The function of the Labour Party is to basically absorb the energies of the subaltern classes and of the union movement, control them, and basically domesticate them, and then through the bureaucratic process of the Labour Party, and then the end result of which is a government that doesn't change a huge amount when it comes into power, when eventually capital decides, actually, you can be the Tory B team and come in, right? So that's always been how the Labour Party is functioning, essentially as a cartel party. But the level of spite and aggression and vitriol with which they have pursued the agenda to destroy the left, combined with the fact that it's happened in the context of a genocide, which has appalled pretty much everyone in the UK, even if it's not reflected in the media, has basically, for the first time, it's actually forced a very substantive, large number of people out of the Labour Party into a different political formation, which is the Greens. Now, that's disastrous for the Labour Party. It really is. Because now they are caught in this middle bit where they're no longer actually that useful to capital. Because if they can't domesticate the insurgent energy of the Greens, then what's the point of them, right? And if they can't, and they rely on the insurgent energy of the grassroots to be the people who get them voted into power. Because those are the people who are going knocking on doors and fighting their wars for them on social media and basically fact checking the mainstream media when it's running right-wing bullshit, right? This has been destroyed. They've left, they've gone somewhere else. So in a sense, for me, like I think now we now see this is going to change. Angela Rayner looks like she's going to run for leader. We're going to have a three-way leadership race between Wes Streeting, Keir Starmer, and Angela Rayner. And that's what it looks like to me at the moment. Those three leaders, every single one of them will destroy the Labour Party within 3 years. It will cease to function as an electoral force that can form a government. I think it'll cease to function as an electoral force that can get more than 100 seats. And I think then really is going to be the big democratic discussion we're going to be having in the UK is to what extent progressive forces and liberal forces and left-wing forces unite behind a different vehicle as a means of opposing reform. And I could see that being the case.
I think we're going to have to leave it there, Paul. It's been an amazing discussion and really illuminating. And, our thanks to you, and our hearts go out to you. And we know it's been quite a week. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Paulie.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks for having me.
Listeners can shout down the party line by emailing theditchpartyline@gmail.com. Obviously, keep up with The Ditch at ontheditch.com. Join the WhatsApp group. Support The Ditch with a donation or a subscription. Also, look at Shadow World Investigations, where Paul and his colleagues are continuing to do amazing work. And I'm sure watch for some stories, I think, in the coming days. Follow the fraud on social media. And you'll see some quite amusing content, as well as some really, really sharp and striking stuff. So thanks again, Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.